They said her eyes could call storms, that her voice could draw wolves from the forest, that her shadow walked before her, whispering to the earth. But the truth was simpler. She was just a woman who knew too much in a time that wanted women silent. Her name was Katharina Kepler, mother, healer, outcast, and she would be remembered as the last witch of Europe. The year was 1615, and the world was split in two, between faith and reason, God and the devil, light and shadow. The old beliefs were dying, replaced by men who thought themselves masters of truth. But fear never dies, it only changes its name. In the small German town of Leonberg, the nights came heavy. The war between heaven and earth was being fought not by soldiers, but by neighbors. And every misfortune, every sickness, every stillborn child, every ruined crop needed someone to blame. The witch trials had burned through Europe like a fever. Tens of thousands of women had been tortured, drowned, hanged, or burned alive. And now, that fever had reached Leonberg. Katharina was not young. Her hands were lined from years of work, her hair streaked with silver. But her eyes, sharp, intelligent, carried the same fire that her son Johannes had inherited. He was a scholar, an astronomer whose name would echo through the centuries. But she was the mother who had taught him to look up at the stars. While the men of the village prayed for rain, she read the sky. While others offered coins for blessings, she gathered herbs and whispered to the roots. And in a world that feared knowledge, such wisdom was a dangerous thing. The whispers began quietly. A cow fell ill. A child took fever. A man's brew spoiled in his cellar. She passed by that morning, they said. She muttered under her breath. She looked at me strangely. Suspicion was like smoke, invisible until it choked you. And soon, all of Leonberg was breathing it. When they came for her, it was not with swords or torches, but with the quiet certainty of righteousness. The town magistrate signed the order. The priest gave his blessing. And so, one cold morning, they took her from her home. They said it was only to question her. But everyone in Leonberg knew what questioning meant. The cell was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of iron and fear. The walls remembered screams, the chains remembered wrists. They asked her if she had spoken to the devil. She laughed. They asked again. She said she had spoken to no one but God. So they pressed harder. Did she make potions? Did she curse the cattle? Did she fly at night? Each denial fed their certainty. Each breath she took became proof of guilt. In those days, innocence was not something to be proven. It was something to be bought, with coin, confession, or silence. But Katharina had none of those to give. Her son, Johannes, was far away, buried in his studies and his stars. He was one of the emperor's mathematicians now, his mind mapping the heavens while his mother was being dragged through hell. Days turned into weeks. The trial began. The accusations multiplied. They said she had poisoned the wine of a neighbor, that she had turned milk sour with a glance, that she had summoned demons in the shape of cats. Each lie was another brick in the pyre they were building around her name. And yet she did not break. Katharina's voice, though tired, never trembled when she spoke. She told them she was no witch, that her herbs were for healing, that her prayers were for mercy, not malice. But the court wanted fire, not reason. Still, word spread, and across the land, her son heard the echoes. Johannes Kepler, the man who had rewritten the laws of the cosmos, who had seen the hand of God in the movement of planets, now faced a truth more terrifying than any equation, that the same world that praised his brilliance would murder his mother for sharing it. He left the emperor's court and rode through rain and mud back to Leonberg. When he arrived, he found her thin, bruised and defiant. The jailer spat as he passed. "She's the devil's wife," he said. But Johannes knew better. He saw not a witch, but the woman who had once held his face to the stars and said, "They burn because they are alive." He swore he would save her. He studied the trial records, the witnesses, the absurdities of their claims. He wrote letters to the Duke of Württemberg, to scholars and priests, to anyone who would listen. He argued with logic, sharper than any blade. But logic had no place in witch trials. The villagers whispered that her son's power came from her, that his success was proof of her pact with Satan, that the stars spoke to him because his mother had stolen light from hell. It did not matter that Johannes Kepler was one of the greatest minds of his age. In Leonberg, reason was treason. And so the court pressed on. They demanded confession. They promised mercy if she would only name her accomplices, the old story of turning pain into spectacle. But she refused. The torturer's instruments gleamed in the candlelight, the thumbscrew, the rack, the spiked chair. The priest crossed himself and prayed for her soul, even as he ordered her suffering. But even under pain, Katharina spoke only the truth. No demons, no witchcraft, no devil. Just herbs, just life, just a woman who had loved too much and learned too deeply. Outside, the town prepared for her execution. They gathered wood and pitch, whispering about the storm that had begun to roll in over the hills, a storm that seemed to move with purpose. By nightfall, the sky was split with lightning. The church bells rang as thunder roared. The villagers said it was the devil coming for his bride. But Johannes, standing outside her cell, knew better. It was not hell that was coming, it was truth. The duke's men arrived at dawn. Johannes had begged for her life, written until his ink ran dry. And at last, his words had reached the ear of someone powerful enough to care. The execution was halted. The court grudgingly agreed to review the evidence, the same evidence that had condemned her. And for the first time in years, the weight of reason began to crack the walls of superstition. It was too late to erase the scars, but not too late to rewrite the verdict. Katharina Kepler was declared innocent, not because the world had changed, but because one man had refused to let it remain blind. When she stepped out of the prison, the sky was still dark with storm clouds. The villagers did not cheer. They turned away, ashamed, confused, afraid of what her freedom meant for them. She had outlived the fire they built for her, but the fire had burned something else, their certainty. Katharina returned home quietly to her small house at the edge of Leonberg. The herbs she once used for healing had withered, the garden overrun with weeds. She tended to them in silence. And though she was free, she was no longer the same. Freedom won through torture is not freedom at all. It is survival. When she closed her eyes at night, she saw faces of the women who hadn't been saved, whose ashes had fed the soil of Europe. And she wondered how many storms it would take before the world stopped calling wisdom witchcraft. The years that followed were quiet. Johannes returned to his stars, haunted by the knowledge that reason could not save everyone. And Katharina, the last witch of Europe, lived long enough to see her name fade from fear into memory. But in the old church records of Leonberg, her trial still sits, pages blackened by candle smoke and accusation, her name scratched beside words like sorcery, heresy, witchcraft. Proof that even in an age of discovery, darkness still clung to the hearts of men. And though her body turned to dust, her defiance did not die. Because the true magic, the kind they feared most, was not in her herbs or her spells, but in her refusal to bow to ignorance. And that, in the end, is what made her dangerous. The fire died in Leonberg, but the smoke carried far. When Katharina Kepler was declared innocent, the world did not cheer. Europe was too busy tearing itself apart. The 30 Years' War had begun, a war of faith, crown, and chaos that would drown the continent in blood. Villages burned, kingdoms fell, and still the pyres smoldered. But something had changed, something quiet, fragile and unstoppable. For the first time, a witch had survived. It did not happen often. The machinery of accusation was too well-oiled, too righteous, too eager for confession. But Katharina's acquittal had cracked the spell of fear that had bound Europe for centuries. The scholars whispered of it. The priests muttered uneasily. Even the judges began to hesitate, if only for a moment, before lighting the torch. Because if one witch could be proven innocent, how many others had been burned for nothing? Her case spread like a rumor carried by wind, across Germany, to France, to the cold stone courts of England and the haunted fields of Scotland. Her name became a question, a whisper of doubt in a world built on certainty. And doubt, once born, cannot be buried. In the years that followed, Johannes Kepler continued his work, charting the orbits of planets, writing the laws that would define motion itself. He looked to the heavens, but he never forgot the earth that had tried to swallow his mother. In his journals, between calculations and star maps, he wrote of her, not as a victim, but as a symbol, a woman who had stood against the darkness and survived it. But for thousands of others, the darkness did not end. From the forests of Poland to the valleys of Switzerland, the cries of the accused still echoed. The witch hunters marched beneath the cross, carrying the tools of their mercy, rope, flame, and iron. Their trials were sermons, their pyres, prayers. In Würzburg, 300 women were burned in a single year. In Bamberg, the smoke blotted out the sun. And in Scotland, the witch-finders travelled from town to town, turning whispers into death sentences. The people believed they were cleansing the world of evil, but what they were really burning was their own fear. It was fear of the unknown, fear of the plague that no doctor could cure, fear of the storm that drowned the harvest, or the child that died in the night. And most of all, fear of women who refused to be silent. For centuries, the word witch had been a mirror, reflecting whatever men feared most. A healer became a heretic. A widow became a temptress. A midwife became a murderer. Every trial was the same story told with new names, until the fire began to run out of fuel. By the mid-1600s, something else was stirring: reason. Books began to challenge superstition. Scholars began to ask questions once thought blasphemous, and slowly, painfully, the world began to see. The witch trials did not end with mercy. They ended with exhaustion. Too many lies, too many corpses, too many ghosts. In 1682, the last execution for witchcraft in England took place. In 1782, Switzerland burned its final witch, Anna Göldi, the last witch of Europe, though the phrase was less truth than tragedy. Her crime was love, her punishment, fire. Anna had been a servant in a nobleman's house. When the man's daughter fell ill, they said it was witchcraft. When they found needles in the girl's milk, they said it was sorcery. No one asked how the needles got there. No one cared. The story of Anna Göldi was not new. It was simply the last echo of a dying madness. She was tortured until she confessed, because that was how truth was made in those days. And though the Enlightenment had already dawned, though philosophers in Paris and London were writing about liberty, reason, and science, the fire still burned in a small Swiss town, fed by the same fear that had once hunted Katharina Kepler. But unlike the others, Anna's death did not fade into silence. Her execution shocked a world that thought itself modern. Pamphlets were printed, protests rose, and the word witch, once a weapon, became a wound. The people began to look back and see the truth they had buried under centuries of ash, that the witch trials were never about the devil. They were about control over thought, over knowledge, over women who dared to speak, to heal, to exist without permission. Katharina had been called a witch because she read the stars. Anna had been called a witch because she loved the wrong man. And thousands of others, nameless, faceless, had been called witches simply because someone needed them to be. Their deaths had built a lie, and now that lie was dying. By the dawn of the 18th century, the flames had gone out. The trials ended not with repentance, but with silence. The churches no longer wanted to speak of the pyres. The judges no longer wanted to remember the screams. Europe had buried its guilt beneath progress, but the ghosts remained. Every village square that once burned with fire still held the scent of smoke in its stones. Every field that saw a hanging still whispered when the wind passed through it. And somewhere beneath all the science and reason, the memory of the witch still lived. She was no longer a threat. She was a symbol of the cost of fear and the price of silence. When Johannes Kepler died, they buried him with honor. His books were preserved, his discoveries celebrated. But his mother's grave was unmarked. No statue, no inscription, no monument, only a patch of earth that once trembled beneath her feet. Yet in a way, her story never ended, because her defiance became the beginning of something new. Centuries later, when historians traced the end of the witch hunts, they found her name, Katharina Kepler, written in the margins of the last great trials, not as a witch, but as a woman whose survival changed the course of persecution. And so the tale of the last witch of Europe is not just a story of one woman suffering. It's a mirror held up to humanity, showing how easily we trade truth for comfort and justice for fear. It asks us to remember, not the fire but the reason it burned, because history has a way of returning. The same fear, dressed in new words, rising again in new forms. Today we no longer burn witches, but we still burn reputations, voices, ideas. We still fear what we do not understand, and somewhere, deep beneath the ashes of history, the whisper remains, be careful what you call evil. Because the witches were never the monsters, they were the mirrors, and when the world looked into their eyes, it saw its own darkness staring back. So if you walk through an old European town and pass a stone square where no grass grows, stop for a moment. Listen. You might hear it, the faint crackle of memory, the soft echo of a woman's voice carried by the wind. Not cursing, not conjuring, just asking one question that still haunts us all. How many truths must burn before the world learns not to fear the fire?